Oklahoma, year one under Brent Venables, this was a major disappointment. And I wasn't expecting anything fantastic from Oklahoma last year. I thought they were at least going to be able to win 7-8 games, but they went 6-7 and 3-6 in Big 12 play. Like, this is kind of unacceptable, and I already know what you Oklahoma fans are about to do. You're about to come in the comment section and type a lot of excuses. Just save it, man. Brent Venables' first season with Oklahoma was a massive disappointment, and it's not really because of the record. It's really because of how awful this defense was. Brent Venables, prior to arriving at Oklahoma, he was regarded as the best defensive mind in most people's eyes in college football. And last year, they were 104th in stopping the run, and they were 116th in stopping the pass. So if Oklahoma is going to have a better season this year in year two under Brent Venables, this defense has to improve. You cannot go into the SEC having another season like what you did last year. And I get that Oklahoma has brought in some really good recruits. They had a really good recruiting class last year, and their current recruiting class for next year looks pretty good as well. But this defense has to make some improvements. And if you're Oklahoma and you're a fan of the Sooners, if you go into the SEC having only won 6-7 games again, things are going to be looking kind of bleak down there in Norman. And this defense definitely has the talent to be better than what it was last year. Your run defense should improve because you bring in a good amount of talent on the interior of that defensive line. You also brought in some pretty good transfers. There's a transfer that you have from Wake Forest. I can't pronounce his name properly, so I'm not going to embarrass myself, but he had 8 sacks for the Demon Deacons in 2021, and he had 6 sacks last season in 2022. And their secondary should be really solid this year. You bring in Reggie Pearson, transfer from Texas Tech, really good player for the Red Raiders. Then you got Billy Bowman, who was one of the best players in your secondary last year. He had 3 interceptions. He had a couple of pass breakups as well, and I think that he's a pretty good tackler as well. And when you look at their cornerback position, there's a lot of upside in this cornerback room. Gentry Williams was highly touted when he was coming out of high school. Woody Washington was probably their best cornerback last year, in my opinion. And I look at linebacker, you got Danny Stutzman, who probably is the best defensive player on Oklahoma's roster going into this year. This defense most definitely has the talent to be able to produce at a higher level than what they did last year. And Brent Venables is a defensive-minded head coach, so if the defense ends up being awful, once again, Oklahoma is not going to be all that good. If you are somebody who specializes on the defense side of the football, then the defense should not be the worst position on your team. It should be a strength. So if the defense continues to struggle, I think that's pretty much going to be the indicator that Brent Venables isn't going to work out for Oklahoma, despite how good they've been on the recruiting trail. Now, their offense, I'm not worried about it at all. I know there's some concerns about the offensive line, but one thing that Oklahoma does a pretty good job at is producing really good offensive linemen. They've had a lot of offensive linemen that have been drafted into the NFL over the last couple of years. And then you have Jeff Lebby as your offensive coordinator. I think this offense is going to be fine. You return Dylan Gabriel at QB. He's one of the more underrated quarterbacks in college football. And if he would have played against Texas, that game could have been a lot different. Listen, I loved me some Eric Gray, but you don't know how surprised I was to see him lining up a Wildcat quarterback for Oklahoma. Like, when I saw them running that Wildcat offense against Texas, I knew it was going to be a long game for Sooners fans, man. You cannot go into a rivalry game with no QB. What happened to that quarterback they had with the fun name, General Booty? Where was he at? Can an Oklahoma fan tell me what happened to General Booty? Why didn't he play in that game? Because I was trying to look it up and I couldn't find any answers. So I really want to know, where was General Booty at last year? And then you look at what they have at wide receiver. Drake Stoops is pretty good. You also have a couple of other guys who return as well. And then you got a couple of big pickups in the transfer portal. You got a really good receiver out of Michigan who does have a lot of upside. But my favorite transfer for Oklahoma on the offensive side of the football was former Texas wide receiver Brendan Thompson. This guy has elite speed, and he reminds me a lot of Jalen Hyatt. For those of you guys who was watching the Vols offense last year, Jalen Hyatt won the Biletnikoff Award last year. He was the dude who had 200 yards and 5 touchdowns against Alabama's defense last year. He has a really similar skill set to him, and if you can get him out in space, I think he could end up having some really big plays for this offense, and I think he could be one of the guys who could end up breaking out for Oklahoma's offense this year. Now, your offensive line is a little bit of a concern to me, but I'm not fretting it too much. You did lose 3 starters, and anytime you lose 3 starters, it's definitely going to take a little bit of work to replace them, but I don't think that the offensive line should struggle this year. I would be a little bit surprised if it did, given the fact that Oklahoma has a really good track record when it comes to developing quarterbacks. Now, how they're going to perform year 2 under head coach Brent Venables, I think the floor is 7 wins and the ceiling is going to be 9 wins. I probably would lean 8 wins this season. I don't think Oklahoma is falling off the cliff. I don't think they have an incredibly tough schedule neither. You got to play Arkansas State to start the season. Then you got to play SMU, which isn't going to be an easy game. And if Oklahoma doesn't show up in that game, they don't bring their A game against SMU, that definitely is a game that they could end up losing, because Rhett Lashlee and SMU, I don't know if you guys been keeping up with what they've been doing over there, but the Mustangs bring in a pretty good transfer portal class. And I don't know why people are deciding to go to SMU, but I do remember that at one point they had a top 5, top 10 recruiting class. Well, not recruiting class, but transfer portal class. So I don't know if they got some money over there at SMU that they've been spending on the transfer portal to bring some of these guys in, or what's been the reason why people are transferring to SMU all of a sudden. But don't sleep on this offense. Rhett Lashlee is one of the best offensive-minded coaches in college football. His offenses can produce a lot of points. And if Brett Venables' defense struggles again this year, I think that this SMU game is going to be the early indicator of that. So if you're an Oklahoma fan, you need to have that SMU game circled on your calendar. That's the game that's going to kind of be an indicator for how this season may go for you defensively. And then you got to play Tulsa. Then you got Cincinnati, which you should be able to win both of those games. So at worst, you're going to get into conference play 3-1, best case scenario 4-0 against Iowa State. And then you got Texas, which is going to be the big game that everybody's going to be looking at. And if you're Brent Venables, if you have another performance like how you did last year, I don't know if you stay around for Oklahoma's move to the SEC, man. Maybe you do because of the optimism, and maybe they don't want to go into a new conference with a new head coach. But imagine getting blown out by Texas for the 2nd year in a row with an actual QB this time. I don't think that would be a good look, and I do think that Texas has the best team in the Big 12 this year. I definitely think that this is going to be the year that they actually live up to the hype. So if Oklahoma loses this game, I know Oklahoma fans are going to be upset because it's a rivalry game, but if they can keep it close, I think that I wouldn't be too upset about that. Texas just has one of the best rosters in college football. If they don't live up to expectations this year, then that says more about them than it does Oklahoma. And then you got to play UCF, which you probably should be able to beat UCF. It's their first year in the Big 12, even though they're coming off the best recruiting class that they've had in recent memory, and they've hit the transfer portal pretty hard. I don't think they're going to be a great team in this conference. I think at best they're going to be a middle of the pack team in this conference. And then the biggest games of the year in terms of this conference has to be Oklahoma-Kansas. Kansas, I think, is definitely being heavily overlooked and underrated. Before Jalen Daniels went down with that injury that he suffered last year, Kansas was 5-0 at one point, and he was in the running for being a legitimate contender for the Heisman Trophy. And they have the most production out of any team in the Big 12 that comes back this year, and they're only going to get better. So for Oklahoma, that Kansas game is going to be really big. And then your last 3 games of the season, Oklahoma State, which I kind of think is starting to trend down now under head coach Mike Gundy. You got to play BYU on the road. BYU is going to be a tough team. They're going to be physical. They may not be good, but this definitely isn't a team that you're just going to push around and blow out. This is going to be a team that's going to give you a dogfight. And then you have TCU to close out the season. So my ceiling for Oklahoma this year is 9 wins. Worst case scenario, 7 wins. Overall, this is a roster that I think should be capable of being able to win 8 games. Now, if they end up winning 7, I would view that as a little bit of a disappointment because their schedule is not too tough. And some of you guys may argue that this should be a 10-win team and potentially be able to compete for a spot in the Big 12 title game, which they definitely do have the talent. I think they have the second best odds at this moment, right behind Texas, to win this conference. So the talent definitely is there, but I do think that there's